Hello, welcome to today's video. Since the start of 2021, I've been asked to make this video 46 times. And before this year, I've lost count of how many times it was, but basically, I've caved in. I'm going to be making some videos on how to use Nuke. So the first thing I want to say very early on is Nuke is actually free. There's the full version of Nuke, which is obviously very expensive. I think it's like £7,000 for a license. There's Nuke Indie, which I currently use in all my videos, and the Foundry's very kindly sponsored my YouTube channel. I think it's $400 a year. It's like a rolling subscription thing. And then originally what I was using for my videos for about 2 years is Nuke non-commercial, and that's the version that's free and that I recommend everyone gets hold of immediately. Strangely, I think lots of people don't realize there is a free version of Nuke, because I get messages on a regular basis saying, I want to learn Nuke, but I can't afford the full license. Now you can, and everyone can, because it's free. My goal with this is basically to make the videos I wish existed when I was learning Nuke, because I wanted people to say this is the button in After Effects and this is how you do it in Nuke, but that didn't exist. So I'm going to try and single-handedly demystify all of that. And with all of that said, let's get into the video. To download Nuke, what you want to do is go to the Foundry's website and then come up here and under Products, click on Nuke. And then if you scroll right down to the bottom, you can see that there's a non-commercial version of Nuke. So click Find Out More, and then scroll down a little bit to this box here and click Get It Now. Basically what you have to do is sign up for an account. Once you've done that, you can go to the downloads page, choose the download for your operating system, and then it will start to download. One slightly quirky thing about Nuke is it downloads all of them at the same time. So if I search for Nuke, it's got Nuke Indie and then the fully licensed versions of Nuke as well. The one you want to open is Nuke X non-commercial. So if you didn't know, this is what Nuke looks like. The way I have mine laid out is slightly different to the default. It looks something like this. So you have the node graph down here and the viewer and then your properties and stuff on the side. Doesn't make any difference to the way it functions, so don't worry about that for now. The key difference between After Effects and Nuke is a node-based compositor, whereas After Effects uses layers, kind of like a video editor. Nuke has what's called nodes, and these are these things if I add some. Basically, each one of these allows you to do different things to the footage, so you can blur it or change the color or move it around. This is a really simple Nuke script from the render challenge that I'm doing on Discord this month. By the way, if you want to get involved in that, the link is below. The way it works is like a flowchart, so you start at the top with a piece of footage or something or an image, and then as you go down, you apply lots of different nodes to it which do things to change the way the image looks. And then right at the bottom, you have an output, and this is basically the final image. So a quick tour of the UI. This is the viewer, and this is where all of the footage will appear. And if I read in something like a lens flare, this is where the image will show up. Down here, we basically have the timeline. This is where you have all of the frames of the footage, and you have your kind of pretty standard play and pause buttons. And there's a few others for like stepping through frame by frame and keyframes and all sorts. Some of these buttons are a bit overwhelming at first, but to be honest, a lot of these ones like down here, I pressed I think once on my first day just to find out what they did and haven't touched them since in 4 years. So bear in mind that a lot of these things you don't need. Over here is the node graph, which I mentioned earlier, and this is basically where all of the nodes go, and adding these nodes and changing the values inside of them will directly change how the image looks. To add nodes, there's a few different things you can do. One way is to come over here to this toolbar on the side, and these are basically all the groups of nodes that you can add in Nuke. I never actually use this. I think it's a bit clunky to have to come over and click on these every time you want to open a node. So what pretty much everyone does is just hover over the node graph and press tab, and then you can search for a node here. And as you start typing, it will give you a list of all the nodes that start with those letters. You can do things like add favorites for the ones that you use most often, and there's also keyboard shortcuts for a lot of the ones you use most often, like transform is T, grade is G, blur is B. It's really handy to memorize all of these, but definitely don't worry about that straight away. One of the main ways that a node-based compositor like Nuke differs from something like After Effects or HitFilm that uses layers is you never actually import any footage. So you might notice there's no like media bin full of footage over here that I have in my project. Nuke uses what's called read nodes to bring in footage, and that's what this is here. And if you hit R on the node graph, it will basically open up a file browser. And from here you can search for a piece of footage and then double click it and it will bring it in. And this node here is your footage. So it has a file path here in the properties that goes to wherever this footage is saved on your hard drive, and you can move it around, put it wherever you want in the script, but this is how you bring in footage. And then at the polar opposite end of the script, once you've added a load of nodes and finished working on the comp, we use what's called a write node to basically render out the finished work. This would be the equivalent of pressing the render button or export or something, and inside the node it's basically the same as the render queue in After Effects, so you tell it where the file's going to go, somewhere on your hard drive, and then when you have all the settings ready to go, you literally just hit render and choose the frame range and everything you want to render and press OK. Okay, so some of the most basic nodes in Nuke. Obviously we've explained what the read node does. One of the key differences between After Effects and Nuke is the way you combine images. So I've got two bits of footage here, one is of me and one is of an explosion, but because there's no layers here like in After Effects, it's not like I can just take one and put it above the other and merge them together. So to do this in Nuke, you use what's called a merge node. The keyboard shortcut for this is M, and I highly recommend just using the keyboard shortcut because you add merge nodes all the time. A merge node has two inputs, and basically the way this works is it takes the A input and puts it over the B input. I like to think of B as the background, so I'm going to plug B into my background footage, and then I'm going to plug the A input into the new piece of footage. And if I look at the merge node now, you can see it's put the explosion on top. And inside of the merge node, there's an operation drop-down box that has all of the blending modes. You'll probably recognize most of these as lots of the names are fairly universal across all software. So for example, because this is fire, if I said it's a screen, then it will probably blend a lot better. Currently really dark, so if I add a grade node and just punch this up to like 30, then you can see it works a lot better. This whole time I forgot to mention the viewer node as well. The viewer node is basically controls what you see in the viewer. The shortcut for looking at a node instead of just plugging it in every time with the mouse is you select the node you want to look at and hit 1. So you can do this to anything and it will allow you to look at that specific node wherever it is in the node graph. And you can see at the moment this input is called input 1. And the cool thing is you can use all of the numbers on the keyboard. So for example, I can select the read node and press 2. And it will create a second input that's going to the read node. And then what I can do is hit 1 and 2 and flick between the two inputs. This is quite handy for comp if you're flicking between maybe a reference image and then what you're actually comping, or if you want to flick between the original plate and some cleanup to compare the difference. And you can do this all the way from 1 to 9 and 0 as well, so I can add an input for all of these and just flick between them like a madman. The next thing most people will probably try and do if they're coming from After Effects is try and drag this around in the viewer. And if you click and drag, you might be like, why isn't this working? To do anything in Nuke, whether it's moving it around in the viewer or changing the colors or anything, you have to add a node. It's basically like adding a process each time. And there are different nodes for doing all of those different things, but the basic one for moving something around is called a transform node. You can press tab and search for transform and it's here, or the keyboard shortcut if you're really fancy is just press T. And the transform node then brings up this tool that you can use to drag it around in the viewport. You can rotate it, you can scale it, and the more common way when you're doing something a little bit more fiddly is you can actually punch in the numbers up here. One of the things I really like about Nuke is you can use the up and down arrows to change the values in these boxes. The next most common one is probably the grade node. So again, you can either search for it or the shortcut is G. And the grade node has a load of different sliders for things you can do to change the exposure and the color of the image. A lot of these like lift and multiply and offset I basically never use anyway. The main ones I focus on are gain and gamma. Similar to how you have highlights and shadows in After Effects or Premiere or something, basically gain is kind of like the highlights and gamma is the darker areas of the image. As well as turning these up and down to change the luminance values, you can also click this color wheel and it will pop out all of the controls for the individual red, green and blue channels. And from here you can make it more red or more green or more blue. And then there's also these three sliders on the side. The far right one is basically just the luminance values, and then the middle and far left one are basically what would be considered color temperature and tint in Adobe products. So this one makes it warmer or cooler, and then the middle one is like a shift between magenta and green. And you have the same for all of these, so gamma has the same controls and obviously all the other ones as well. And then the other ones that I use quite regularly for CG stuff is the white point and the black point. This is basically the absolute darkest value in the image and the absolute lightest value in the image. You may also notice that on some nodes there's a triangle on the side, and this is actually a mask input. And if I click and drag this, you can see it expands into another input with a mask. And the idea with this is you can plug in something that has an alpha channel. So if I just draw a very quick mask, and then I take the mask input and plug it into the roto, then when I change something in the grade node, it's only going to affect the area that I've drawn the mask. Unlike in After Effects where you just grab the pen tool and start drawing on it, if you want to draw a mask in Nuke, you have to actually add a roto node. The shortcut for the roto node is O, and once you add a roto node, over here on the side of the viewer, this pop-up will appear with some extra tools. The most important one is probably the shape tool, and this is the one that has all the different options for the kind of masks you can draw. As you can probably imagine, the roto node can be used for just masking out certain bits of an image. So if I do this, you can see it just cuts out the areas I've selected. As well as the roto node, we also have what's called the roto paint node. And again, you can search for it, or the keyboard shortcut is P. And the roto paint node basically has a load of what could basically be considered Photoshop brushes in it. So there's an actual brush tool which you can use to just draw on the image. There's also a clone tool which is similar to the clone stamp in Adobe stuff, and you can use it to clone parts of the image. There's tools for blurring and sharpening and smearing the image, and then there's also burn and dodge tools which again are very similar to Photoshop, and these can be used to make an image lighter or darker. Obviously, if you look at these lists, you can see there's loads of other nodes that I haven't mentioned yet. Lots of these, even professionals will probably tell you they don't use very often or not at all. I don't even know what bilateral does. But the ones I've covered in this video are kind of like the bread and butter of Nuke. Once you kind of understand them, you'll be in a good place. So if you made it this far into the video, I hope you've learned something and I hope this video was useful. Now that's the basic housekeeping of doing a quick tour of the UI and talking about the basics of how Nuke works. I'm going to start releasing some videos on more specific topics like keying and cleanup and tracking. Leave a comment below if there's anything specific you'd like to see or know how to do in Nuke. And until next time, thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you very soon.